Here is a basic front princess bodice torso. It's an arm's-eye princess, and as with many commercial home sewing patterns, we have a curved fit that goes to the apex, and then there's usually not a whole lot of contouring that happens under the bust. And once we get this sewn together, we're going to take a look at contouring under the bust a little bit better on the form. Now, most of the time, your home sewing pattern is going to have 5/8 inch seam allowance. And if that is the case, I strongly recommend, at least for the front arm's-eye princess seams, to trim off 1/8 of an inch from each edge so that you end up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. One of the first things that I do to avoid stretching out delicate areas that are cut along the bias, which is the neckline and the underarm, is I always do a stay stitch just slightly less than what the seam allowance is. So in this case, the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to do just slightly, a 1/16 of an inch or so, less than a 1/2 inch. I'm not going to be heavy-handed because I don't want to further stretch out those delicate areas. So I'm actually going to use my fingers in a very tactile way to kind of coax that together. I'm using red thread so that you can see. And I'm using an industrial sewing machine, and one of the advantages of an industrial, some home sewing machines have this also, but I'm able to raise and lower the presser foot using a knee lift. Now, I will try to simulate what happens at home when you need to raise and lower the presser foot as an example on one of the sides. So I'm going to do that stay stitch here, just slightly less than a 1/2 inch. And I'm putting my finger kind of behind the presser foot. I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, I'm just barely coaxing it through. So there's my neckline stay stitch. And I'm going to do the same thing for the armholes because they're on the bias and I don't want them to stretch out while I'm handling. And the other armhole. And if you don't do your stay stitch exactly even, don't worry about it. Its purpose at this point is to give a little stability. Now, onto the princess seams. It's easier for me to do this first, the wearer's right-hand side, because for some reason it's easier for me to work in this bust curve and kind of see how much ease was intended than it is to work the other side. Now, keep in mind, we always want to keep the curved side up, just like you would a sleeve going into an armhole. So this side, keeping my bust curve up, I'm going to start from the bottom to the top, and on this side, keeping my curve up, I'm going to start from the top to the bottom. Now, in industrial sewing, we usually don't use a lot of pins, but I'll do an example of pinning so that you can simulate this, because I know at home it's more comfortable for a lot of you to sew with pins, but we generally survive from notch to notch when we're sewing. Now, if you'll notice here, notch to notch, there's actually a little more bust curve than there is flat section. So I'm going to show how to ease that in. And same thing from the center bust here to the next notch, we're also going to be easing that in all the way to the top. So I'm going to put those, I'm going to pin in these notches so that notch meets notch. Now, I notice in home sewing, you'll often put your pins going diagonal like this. And that's one thing that I discourage for a number of reasons. One, having all of these pins sticking out and creating a ripple going this direction is not the natural flow of the seam line. Plus, I'm not very fond of additional straight pin needle penetrations going into the body of the garment. Sometimes those pin marks will not come out. So I never want to pin beyond the 1/2 inch seam allowance, or whatever your seam allowance is that you're using. So I actually put the pin in going this way. Now I'm going to the next notch. I'm going to line that up there, and I'm going to pin it in. The other reason I enjoy pinning this way is I'm able to also quickly fold over and audition how my garment's going to stitch together more in the natural way that it would happen with the real stitching. Now my next notch here, and you can already start seeing as I'm putting these notches together, see the extra ease that's happening in the bust curve? We need to work that in, and I'll show you in a second a few of my handling methods to do that. Okay, so here's this side here. Now, a lot of you, when you're sewing, I notice, don't really put your fingers very close to the needle, and I don't blame you for that. It's probably can be intimidating that you might sew through your finger. But the closer you're able to get to your stitching using your fingers in a very tactile, crawling way, as opposed to doing this or pushing and pulling back here, is you're going to have more control over where your stitching is laid and more control over easing in this bust curve right here. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of a back stitch, and just concern yourself with surviving from point A to point B, meaning from this point to your first notch. Don't worry about the whole thing right now, or it can get overwhelming. I'm going a little slow so you can see. Now, I'm not fond of sewing over needles either. So just before I get to this needle section, see how I'm able to just easily pull this needle out, and I actually have a little pad here on my sewing machine. Now my next notch is here, and I'm going to use my little thumb and index finger here to really pinch this, and use my other hand, and see how I'm coaxing and holding down all of this here. I'm just kind of inching it in, keeping everything smooth and flat, and I can even feel with my finger that I don't have any pleats or any bubbles underneath. So now we're going to pull out this pin, and again I'm pinching my fingers here at the next notch point, which is where I happen to have the pin, and see that rippling of ease that I'm going to coax in little by little, and I'm keeping my edges together of the top and the bottom. And you also want to try not to pull too hard. We're not pushing, we're not pulling, we're just letting the machine presser foot and the feed dogs grab it in there. And you can see how close I am here. So now I'm coming in for the home run at the top. And now we have this first princess line. And you can see, again, very similar to when you put a sleeve in, see how my stitch line is smooth right here, even though we have this extra ease of a curve, this rippling here in the bust. And then if we turn to the other side, it's also smooth. There's no pushing or pulling. And now we'll turn that to this side here, and the normal natural direction that this seam allowance is going to want to go because of the bust curve. It wants to go towards the center of the body. And most of the time I do press my princess seams, my front bust princess seams, going towards the center of the body. In some circumstances I do press them open, and if I do, I'm careful. See how there's tension here on the center front side? I'm careful to give some release stitches there, but if you look on the outward curve here, there's actually too much fabric when you try to press it open. So in those instances, I would need to clip out little pie wedges so that it can lay flat and smooth. So you have to do quite a bit more work to get it smooth if you press open. So a lot of times I do end up just pressing towards the center front. So now we have that side in, and now we're going to do the other side. Since we still want to keep that curved panel on top so that we can ease in that extra bit of fabric that needs to create that smooth curve, now I'm going to be going from the top to the bottom. So I'm going to match up the first notches. I'm going to insert my pin within the seam allowance, and I tend to go parallel. And now you can see here at first glance, again, it's going to feel like you have more princess bust curve to fit into the notch. So what you're going to do is you're going to back it up, match up those notches, and put in your pin. And I tend to kind of finger it a little bit to kind of pre-coax and pre-ease that little bias section in before I start sewing. And our next notch, usually most patterns, or good patterns for a princess seam over the bust, should have at least 3 notches. One at or near the bust point, about 2 or 3 inches above the bust point, and 3 inches below the bust point. I'm not going to put any pins down here at the bottom because I think we can survive just fine going from this notch to the bottom. And we're going to start at the top here. And we're going to do the same thing we did before, just going from top to bottom instead of bottom to top. So a little back stitch there. And again, very clampy finger tactile behavior from this position to this notch. And I kind of smooth out this bias section with my fingers as I go. Pull out the pin. And now it's time to survive to the next notch. You see how I'm coaxing again this little ease section? Now you might be saying, well, sometimes when I sew in a sleeve head into an armhole, I stay stitch the curved portions of the sleeve to get it into the armhole. And that sounds good in theory, but you don't actually have a lot of ease in your bust curve. It's more a behavior of the concave and convex curvature that happens. And also I discourage ease stitching just the curve by itself before you do the seam. And the reason for that is if you accidentally ease it by itself with a stay stitch, it could backfire on you and actually become a little too taut when you lay it in. So I really encourage just finger easing it in as you go, as opposed to doing any sort of stay stitch or easing stitch before you do the seam. Alright, so there we did from bottom to top for this side, from top to bottom to this side, and we end up being smooth with no pinches or puckers. And when we press these to one side, going towards the center front, they will lay nice and smoothly. Now I'm going to take this to the dress form next to show you how we can do alterations to fit a little more contoured under the bust, and also what to look out for as far as fit on the actual wearer's body, as far as the apex position and other things to look for in the neckline. Okay, this video is to show how to apply more contouring under the bust line in an arm's eye princess seam. This could be for a style that has shoulders, just like this example I've done. It could be for a strapless, any instance where you want to get a more shapely, formal silhouette. Now, most of the time when you get a home sewing pattern, the contour usually works out well up to the apex. And a note about the apex: you want to make sure that princess seam to princess seam at the apex matches that same position of your wearer, the person wearing the garment. If it's not, you may need to move your princess seams inward or outward accordingly. But in this particular instance, my apex to apex princess seam location worked out well for this girl. But if you look from the side, there's not much shape happening under the bust and into the waist. I would imagine that the reason for this is it's not easy to predict in ready-made patterns what the cup size of the wearer is going to be, so it's easier to accommodate the overall bust circumference, but the amount of contouring that would happen under the bust would be greatly dependent on the person's cup size, so I imagine they're playing it safe there. What we're going to do is we're going to equally pinch right under the bosom, which is usually about 2.5 to 3 inches from the apex on a B cup. It could be more or less depending if the person's cup size is larger or smaller. So right now I'm able to pinch a 1/2 inch under the bosom on each side. So I'm going to pinch and pin, and I'm doing the pin in an elongated fashion here. And now I'm going to pin the other side in the same manner. Pinch and pin. Now you'll see that, let's see, we still have to blend into the apex. So I'm going to tug where I just put that pin, and you want to avoid pinching out at the apex itself. If the whole overall bust circumference of your garment is too big to accommodate the bust, then we want to try to take that out elsewhere, because to alter the actual bust curve at the apex becomes quite a challenge, because you're not able to just pinch and alter anymore. You're changing the actual shape of the convex and concurve, and you'll have to actually rewalk your pattern. So try to avoid going beyond the apex here. So I'm starting at 0 at the apex, going gradually into a 1/2 inch under the bust here, because that's what this particular fit calls for on this one. Alright, so I've got that there, and now I'm going to continue to pinch until it feels comfortable. And what you'll usually find is there's quite a drastic nip under the bosom, and I'm continuing down. I'm feeling about 3/8 of an inch here at the midriff. You just pin whatever feels comfortable and natural, but you want to do so in a balanced way. Because of this curve, this nice, pretty conforming shape. I generally avoid, when doing fitting and alterations, of just wanting to grab the center back where the zipper is to try and get a closer fit, because the fit is actually more desirable having this contour than it is just yanking out the back. It's not just yanking the center back seam is not going to change the fact that there was a very very straight apex to waist shape instead of this curve. Alright, so you see here we have, you can probably see a nice view here. Now we're actually shaping the bust if we were to take this seam. And since we only worked from the apex down, we're able to mark the pins for the new sew line, unstitch the muslin, lay it on top of each respective pattern piece, mark off your new sew line, and then offset your 1/2 inch seam allowance for your new cut line as well.